Welcome to All Things Africa, the podcast. Listen in as Levy, Mike, and Linda discuss socio-political and economic current events and how they affect Africans worldwide.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of All Things Africa. Today, our discussion centers around Black consciousness. That's the topic that we are looking today. Quite an important topic that has a significant influence on how we deal with racism and neocolonialism, shapes our individual worldviews, shapes our values, shapes our beliefs, shapes our actions, shapes how we approach history, shapes how we look at things today. It's a manner of thought that has consequence. It's a manner of thought that shapes the way we fight against these issues on racism and neocolonialism around the world, actually. And as independent people who adopt these core values around Black consciousness, it shapes essentially how we interact around our communities and how we live our lives and how we think about our position as Blacks, and even for those who are interested in looking at these issues of Black consciousness and looking at the world from that standpoint or that viewpoint for that matter, and acting from that viewpoint. It's an ideology to some. It's a way of liberating ourselves. It's a way of acting against forces that continue to oppress and subjugate, and also forces that create servitude. So it is indeed important at an individual level. It's important at a community level. It's important in asking ourselves how we navigate these complexities that neocolonialism and racism have created and shaped our lives. So today, those are all the issues that we want to grapple with. We will not be able to explore everything. It's impossible to explore everything in one podcast, but at least we want to put on the table a few things that you and us can explore and things that we can come back to and talk about. So we hope that you will stay with us until the end of the podcast and even come back for more conversations on this issue. All right, so with Black consciousness, if we think about tracing it back to Stephen Biko, we can think about how he advocated for three things that can help us to sort of have a discussion around these three things and where we are as individuals and where people are with this and how people are grappling with this. One of the things that Black consciousness in the form that Biko advocated for was the unity against oppression. He also advocated for Africans and those who consider themselves Black to take pride in their ancestry, especially in the resistance sense. And also the idea that we are called to act on that consciousness that we create. And a big part of it is the liberation of ourselves from racism and the grip of racism. So in that sense, then you find that the Black consciousness calls individuals to insist on liberation across the board, so that it's not just liberation of Blacks in Africa, but liberation of Blacks also in diaspora. And in doing so, then you begin this process of expressing Black consciousness. So you have a visual sense of it that sort of moves beyond the idea of race. But I think the key thing for us is to think about what it means to different people and how people can translate this idea worldwide. And consistent thing that most people have found around it, for most people who've looked at this issue of Black consciousness, is the idea that people begin this process of self-realization, or the idea of liberation of your mind, or the idea that you have an enhanced identification with your particular history. And we had this conversation with Nanre in the previous podcast, where Nanre talked about the role of history and the importance of history. So you could see that people have these three strands. One is this: you come to this point of self-realization. I could use an example here. I was having a conversation with African diaspora, a youth, recently, because I work with youth. And this youth had done some work on achieving this self-realization, and she had this moment of realization that she has been going along the grain with things and not questioning what being Black means to her. And this belief sort of struck her that it's very important. So you could see that then she began this process of trying to figure out how does she then liberate her mind. And the thing is, I think the key part for her was that she started realizing that she needs to enhance how she identifies with her own history, especially the history where she comes from in Kenya. One of the things she was pointing out was that how historically she's come to the realization that the knowledge that her ancestors have, which is also, this pride that Biko was talking about, that we need to have, and she realizing that that pride with her ancestry is so important to her. One of the things that she was talking about doing as a project is going to Kenya and visiting the elders, especially her grandmothers and her grandparents, and tapping into their wisdom, archiving that knowledge that they had that perhaps was sort of so has been sort of squashed by other kinds of ways of thinking that may have not considered those as ways of thinking. Because if you go back to the days of colonialism and you go back to the days of slavery, the ways in which slaves communicated was also not sort of considered as intelligent enough. But other scholars have said that those were ways of thinking, and they were very important ways of thinking because those were thinking beings and people who were thinking through oral songs, oral tradition, folk stories, and things like that. So these students were saying that she really wants to identify with that history. So I think maybe we can begin by just thinking about how these ideas mean to us from a Black consciousness perspective.
Yeah, for me, I think for us, we bring in unique perspective here because we are from the continent, but we're also living abroad in America. And I remember, on the thought process of understanding ourselves or re-identifying with ourselves, and I guess learning to love our Blackness. I remember when I first came to the U.S., I'm coming from South Sudan, where we have deep history and who we are. We're constantly reminded of who we are within our families and our clans, our village, all the way down to genealogy or some of the cultural practices. And I always thought, everybody must have this kind of rich history of, knowing their background and understanding their backgrounds and all this stuff. And to an extent, I think most Africans do, but you never really think of it as something that you needed to have. It's like we already had it. It was a part of our upbringing to talk about what is culturally acceptable, how you behave, how men behave, what marriage means, and what polygamy means to us, and blah blah blah, all this stuff. And I never really thought about, like, why do you guys have to keep saying this? Why do you have to keep sharing it until you are away from your culture, And then once you're away from your culture, you realize that there's a distinct difference in how others live and how other cultures behave and do things. And I remember in school trying to connect with my African American counterparts in school, and there just was a disconnect between, us. I think Nanre had said, people were calling Africans African booty scratchers and all this stuff, and we're like, what? Nobody does that. Nobody does that. We're not running around in the village naked, and all this stuff. And then you find out that there's a portrayal in this Western world through TV, through everything, that creates a distaste for the African culture or Black culture back home, or even more importantly, it creates a distortion of what that is, and so a large majority of the people I talk to, when I would tell students in my class, when they ask me where I'm from, I go, I'm from South Sudan. Well, where is that? And I'm like, well, in Africa. And they're like, oh, you came from Africa? How'd you get over here? And for the longest time, in their mind, there was no way that you were flying from Africa. And I'm like, we flew. What do you mean? They're like, oh, you didn't swim across the ocean? No, I didn't swim across the ocean. And then, of course, I would try to use that as a joke. Anytime somebody would ask me, I'd go, oh, yeah, we swam across the ocean to get over here. And
Yeah.
they're like, what? And a lot of that has to do with, history of Africa not being taught properly. When I tell people, when we would talk learning about Egypt and all the civilization of Egypt, most of the people in the class thought Egypt was like part of Europe, because of the way they teach it. And the images that they use are very light-skinned people that look way more Mediterranean than African. And then you find out, even when they're using the map, they almost they take the map of Egypt away from Africa, which is really interesting. And so, growing up, you realize the importance of why your culture, your country, your clan constantly told you who you were, what we believe, what we do, why we think this way, we think that way. And the older I get, I realized that there's a real disservice done in the Western world of the way our history is taught to us, and then the distortions that are given not just to ourselves, but also, say, to the white counterparts, and so everyone grows up with this mindset of what Africa is and is not. And to me, Black consciousness means you really got to get back to what is really Africa and what is it really not, out in this world. And you probably hear my son in the background screaming. This is what it was like working from home. So, but it's really interesting, because in order for us to love ourselves, and I think about that year of return for African Americans to Africa, just being invited back and to come see, and then so many of them seeing Africa for the first time and realizing it's not what they've been taught, and that they can belong, and that it probably feels like home more for some of them, or the fact that it is a breath of fresh air to see nothing but your own people everywhere, and I really thought that was really poignant what she said, and it makes me think about ways that we need to be careful to understand our history, our culture, our values as Africans and as Black people, based upon our own understanding of who we are, not others. Even down to, you see the hatred that begins to happen in I don't know about in other countries, but I see a lot of women lightening their skin. Now men are lightening their skin too. There's, everyone wants to wear more Western hairstyles or white hairstyles and all this stuff. Nobody wants to have their natural hair out. These are things and indications that we are growing a distaste for ourselves and our culture and our being, and that it's time to take all that back and come back to it and understand who we are. Because I think once you do understand, you start to love yourself better.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, like you were saying, we have different perspectives of what it means to be Black in a country where we didn't, we all born and raised in Africa. So it's interesting how part of our journey in terms of where we are now, in terms of how we look at what Black means, is shaped in different contexts. Like for me, for example, we didn't grow up at the time where we saw the Steve Bikos. We were reading about them. So we were reading about the Steve Bikos, we were reading about the Patrice Lumumbas, we were reading about these guys, their philosophies and how they identified with their cultures, their communities themselves, and then projected that into their different forms of struggles for liberation. So, and then it was clear that those themes, those narratives, how they connected with their identity was a comparable experience with how Black American leaders here in the civil rights era connected with themselves and their own identities of what it meant to be Black.
Yeah.
It's like they were being formed in the same furnace of structures of oppression, whether it's political, economic, you know, cultural, right?
Mm.
So the question of the Black consciousness was not differentiated by geography because of that shared experience that really pushed a certain shared narrative of what it meant to be Black. So, you know, even our curriculum, just like Linda, you were saying how, you know, the teaching and the instruction, the knowledge of just the curriculum content of Africa, historically, even now in many education systems in the U.S. is fairly poor, you know, to say the best. But we also, by the time I believe, by the time we came around, our curriculum in school wasn't that good either in terms of helping us connect to a African consciousness that was sort of the manner and style of like a Steve Biko. So, and we didn't learn, you know, we came out with a different, therefore you come out with a different sort of idea of what it means to be Black or African. That when you fly out, when you come to a different country like the U.S., when you meet Black Americans, you are then confronted with a different expression of what that means. So it shocks you when when you get resistance from them, or when they're not as friendly as you expect, or they just look at being Black and being African as very different things when you were looking at them as being the same. So to them, being Black and African is not the same thing. We fused those things. So their expression is different than ours, but there's also a lot to learn about how they express and experience their Black identity that we also need to sort of take note of. So, for example, there are many parallels between some of the struggles in Black communities that we can identify or we can see in our African communities as well. So, for example, the residual effects of different forms of economic oppression and what that does in terms of fracturing the communities, Black American communities. You can see the same things in Africa, right? And the thing that we can both, because if you look at the post-colonial effects, for example, and what those look like in terms of how they fractured our communities and our sense of community, or even our sense of being African, you can kind of draw parallels to some of the African American experience here. But one of the things that we can, I believe, we can agree across different continents is that at least we recognize, at least it seems like an awakening to recognize that, hey, we are stronger the more united we are, right? And the more we connect with our Blackness, the more we connect to a Black consciousness, in a way we validate it within ourselves. Like it doesn't need to be validated outside the community. We validate it within ourselves, right? Use that as a strength to empower ourselves economically, politically, socially, etc. That kind of lesson can also bear a lot of fruits in some of our African countries. The idea that the more united we are, the more we leverage on our own strengths and project that towards a particular goal, the better off we're going to be as a society, right? And maybe being Black, that shared need of unity and finding validation and Blackness within the community, regardless of what other races feel about what our contributions are, then the closer we get to tapping back into what you're saying, Linda, we need to get back to our roots of what it meant to be Black, because we need something to tie us together. But once we find that thing, I believe it will just kind of coalesce around the potential that it can bring for the community and what it means to be Black.
Mm-hmm. That's well stated. And I think we're just building off on what Mike said. One of the things that, was pointed out a while ago by Bishop Tutu, was that, if we view ourselves from Eurocentric lenses or other kinds of lenses, there is a danger there in the sense that you can get to a point where you see yourself, or Blacks can get to a point where they see themselves as inferior and not human. And that can be detrimental, because then you have this situation where you have a white person who may be viewed as superior to the Black person. And I think touching on some things that Linda pointed out is that in that same vein, then it should become a way of life. And if Black consciousness is then an attitude of mind, the attitude of how we carry ourselves, then it should also be a way of how we live, right? And I think it ties well with Mike's point also, in the sense that the essence or the idea here was usually that the Black people should rally together as brothers and sisters around the same cause of oppression that they face, and how they are undermined by the same oppression, which is interesting, connecting it to the current issues with Black Lives Matter, because in the Black Lives Matter, then we can think about it in terms of these experiences of history that we see in these cases of that the Black Lives Matter is challenging, in the sense of history of slavery, history of the Jim Crow era, history and things like civil rights movements and so forth. Because then when you think about the issue of Black consciousness, the idea then becomes, and has always been, this idea that this ability to challenge neo-colonial practices wherever they may be in the world, so that it's not just neo-colonial practices in Africa, but just wherever they may be in the world. So we are driven by this interest in aligning and allying around this area. One of the more tangible experiences, examples that we could think about is just laws, unjust laws, because the Black Lives Matter movement has been challenging these issues of police brutality, which, Mike, as you pointed out, they're not just issues in the US. These police brutality issues are also occur in Africa. And then there are issues of unjust laws that target Blacks that need to be changed. And I think we could also see in the cases of in African cases that there are laws that perhaps are international laws that are also unjust, and that they affect Africans as much as they affect the larger Black community around the world. So the same push that the same movement, issues that Black Lives Matter is moving against, is the same issues that we are also still fighting in other forms. I was just looking at this material today on decoloniality, right? Decoloniality in education and decoloniality in knowledge construction. And this is something that Nandre was also pointing out, in the sense that the way knowledge has been sort of created or constructed can sort of leave out these important histories that we need to take into consideration. So I do like that point, Linda, that you're making, in the sense that it also ties into this idea of self-awareness, the idea of who we are, and how we can tap into that, and tap into what Mike is also pointing out as, how do we tap into that and push towards the kind of change we want? How can we tap into the pride that we have as a Black community? How can we tap into the idea of self-determination, the idea of unity around these issues, in the sense that we promote these political issues that we care about as Black people?
Yeah, I think you both make really good points, and something that sticks out to me is the idea that we are all equally oppressed. There's been different strategies for the oppression, but it's all common among Blacks in general. And I think it's so important for us to recognize that. To me, that's the first consciousness awareness that needs to happen, is that we need to recognize that we've all been oppressed by a common group of people, and that this oppression continues on, even down to economically or socially, when it comes to people looking at Africa and why it's underdeveloped, we all will often talk about, oh, it's the leadership, it's all of these issues, but there is something that's the undercurrent, which is the outside support that creates this complacency in leadership and even socially. You know, you get down to the village level and people have an expectation that some other group is going to take care of them. And so to me, that dependency on outside aid or support is something that continues to be an issue when people look at Africa, but I see the same issue in a different lens when it comes to, say, the US welfare system, right? Yet recognizing that 60% of the people on welfare are white people, but when it comes to the political talks about welfare, they talk about it as if it's an overwhelming number of people that are Black people. Yes, in proportion to the number of Black people in the country, 13%, there, you know, for there to be something like 30% that are on welfare is huge for that people group. But I think what's happening here is that I would like to say that the bigger issue is that we are the ones that are providing the aid or the welfare do it in a way that's not so structured for the success of the recipient. So such as welfare in the US is created in almost in a way where if you try to get ahead, right? So if you try to get 2 to 3 jobs while you're on welfare, you'll immediately get kicked off welfare before you even get your first check. As soon as they know that you have a job, you're kicked off welfare because they're checking that system constantly, right? So if you're kicked off welfare right away, as soon as you try to get 2 jobs or 3 jobs just to support yourself and save more money so you can get out of welfare, now you're basically telling them, you know, well, you can go pursue these 3 jobs, but in the meantime, you're missing out on these bills. You now have a new bill, you have this and that. So there's not like a stepping system, right? A stepping stone. You're not covered for a period of time. So while you get yourself off the ground, in order to help anybody, anyone knows this with a family. If I'm getting ready to go to college, the months before I go to college, if not years, we're trying to save money so that there's a gap, right? So you have a cushion, you have savings, you have something to fall back on. With all of these systems, the way it is it's like, it's either you use it or you lose it. But because you're not standing enough where you can properly use it while not being afraid of falling down by letting it go, you become dependent on it. So if every time I'm looking at the opportunity of working 2 or 3 jobs or getting a job that pays more, I'm worried that I'm going to lose welfare or support or aid because I'm stepping far, it puts you in a position where you're constantly doing just enough to keep getting support, but not enough to break free. And I feel like the same mindset happens when it comes to aid. A lot of governments, they don't make enough money from their natural resources or industries within that country to be able to fully take care of their country, because for so long they were oppressed, just like the Black people in America. For so long, they were oppressed either through slavery or Jim Crow or segregation, all kinds of things. So there's been so much oppression. Once they're finally quote unquote free, then they're giving this new system of like, okay, we're going to help you out, but you know, if you try to go too far, then you don't need our help anymore. And it creates this dependency system and a cycle of oppression. So as soon as a country in Africa wants to go without aid, then they're like, fine. as if they have the systems in place to be able to move forward and do it on their own, which is really hard to do early on when those countries are just coming out of a place where there was been constant war that's fed by outsiders, you know, and now they need to be able to establish their own country with their own resources, with their own GDP, but it's not enough. And so instead of getting support a certain way, it's always, this is how this money is going to be used, or else, you know. And I think that is something that we need to understand, that we really got to support ourselves through this freedom process, or recognize the oppressive system that's in, even while we're considered free.
Right, and that's those different forms of the different forms of structural mechanisms and designs to either or oppress or impede, or just make that upward climb a little bit more steeper for whether it's people of color or Africans in Africa. There's different ways that has happened and is happening over time. And but you're right, and part of that, in terms of overcoming it or pushing back against it, really starts with being aware that it's happening, right? And then pulling back into the community and realizing we really have to garner strength amongst each other and leverage the best that we can here within ourselves in order to push back. Because this is, if we wait for sort of the rules of the game to even out, then we are outsourcing our rate of development to somebody else's time and design. But the more we are intentional about, okay, how do we leverage our strengths? You know, where have we? And then also looking in the mirror and saying, where have we failed? You know, because there are opportunities that we've also dropped the ball on. You know, if we're to be honest about some of the leadership that we have seen on the continent as well, which has made us lose several orders of opportunities that could have been impactful to different people's lives. So that's one thing where we have to be honest with ourselves about, but also recognize that if we were to get that right, the leadership and again, leveraging our collective strengths and thinking out the box about what that looks like. It doesn't have to necessarily be about only Africans in Africa working towards that goal. It could be with Black Americans or Africans in America or Africans in Europe, helping towards those efforts and everybody sort of mutually benefiting, especially if you think about it in terms of, the economic gains that could happen if that was to work out in a certain way. But I really think, in order to facilitate that or enable that intentionality, the question of what it means to be African or Black really could be used to kind of encourage that type of thinking and action amongst Black people everywhere, or Africans, in Africa or anywhere, because no one else is going to do it for us. We have to do it for ourselves in a way where we're also critical of ourselves.
I think one thing Michael pointed out is this idea of, number one, being aware of that oppression and it's happening, but also being aware of the different forms of structural oppression. Because when you realize those forms of structural oppression, then there is a call to respond to that. If you think about various forms, I mean, the key forms, I think, of structural oppression that could be seen in neocolonial tendencies and also in racism are, exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural dominance, or imperialism and violence. And these are seen in studies that look at these components. But if you look at neocolonialism and racism, you'll see the same thing. If you just take, for instance, that element of marginalization, a friend of mine likes to say that we have the potential to self-marginalize ourselves as well, which could be that, you could self-marginalize by not having that realization that you are just as superior as the other person. As a Black person, you're just equally superior and you can do what the other person can do, and can lead to that. So, it doesn't have to be that the structure sort of marginalizes, but you can self-marginalize yourself from having that opportunity to play a central role. So if you look at some people, for example, there's this wonderful book called Brown Skin, White Masks, something of that sort. If I hope I'm not getting it wrong. Yeah, Brown Skin, White Masks by Dabashi, where he talks about, okay, this is for me, right? For when I'm thinking about myself as an intellectual, and he's thinking about his claim. One of his claims is that intellectuals who are in the diaspora, who come from their continents, are more likely to forget and actually perpetuate these forms of oppression, because of that ability to stop and realize that they are doing it and they're perpetuating it and they're supporting that oppression. And so that idea of critical consciousness then is crucial, and is a crucial part of Black consciousness, because you come to that point of realizing, because it has to begin with that idea of consciousness, that you have realized that there is something wrong here, there is something that's going on here and has to be questioned, because there's that emphasis that in the context of Blackness, there is a unifying aspect that can unify all of us, but against those forms of oppression, so that we can sort of, I think if you think about the idea of centering, because if we've been marginalized, then like Mike is saying, no one is going to do it for you. You have to center yourself somewhat, but you also have to fight to center yourself. And I think this was what people like Biko were saying. You're not going to just get that by sitting back and looking. You need to awake to the fact that you have to claim it, and you have to fight to get back to the center, to be seen, and for your voice to be heard, and for what you want to happen the way you want it to happen. And until you kind of push yourself to the center, you will always be at the margins.
Right, and that plays out in different ways, right? And looks different in different spaces.
Yes.
But we really have to be conscious about it, because sometimes I think about you pick, maybe you think about a friend of yours who is back home, wherever they are, and in their apartment, engaging with whatever it is they're doing. I find that I struggle amongst my circle of friends to get conversation going around the question of what it means to be African, or what it means to be Black for them. Yeah. And that by itself, to me, then it sort of shifts their focus away from what you're talking about, and so it gets harder to get the community to that point of centering if there is no intentionality behind regular people just thinking about these questions and realizing that they're important for their own for outcomes in their own individual lives.
Absolutely.
Wherever they are, whether that's in the middle of Addis or Dar or wherever. It matters how you view your Blackness, your Africanness, and it matters how you are connecting that to your lifestyle. It matters how that's being connected to the general value system in the community. It matters for how that's connected to how the economic potential of the area is leveraged. And fighting for the rights to really, even just the idea of fighting for the rights to take all the, maybe not all, but the fair share of the economic spoils from some of the resources we have. We're still struggling with that.
Yeah.
So in different places in Africa, and that, to me, even just being aware that is still happening, and wondering how, somebody in the middle of Dar can participate in even just an awareness campaign to about still corrupt practices and corrupt dealings around something like our resources.
Yeah.
I think most Africans care. Most Africans might be feeling exhausted or defeated that it's still happening, and kind of used to it, and almost thinking, we just have to find a way to work ourselves around it to our own success. But that's never going to be enough. We really have to be caring for regular people's lives. People really have to be caring and connecting their identity with being willing to participate in like fighting for the center, like you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really do like what you said about fighting to get back to the center, and that it's an ongoing struggle. And to Mike, what you're saying about just being able to have these discussions among ourselves, to me, it's the first layer, the first step of that consciousness.
Yeah.
If we're not comfortable discussing what it means to be Black and what it means to be African, then we're not going to be comfortable talking about how to change the systems of oppression that we have had. So if we can't handle that resistance within ourselves to get back to the center, we're definitely not going to be able to handle it from a societal level or tribal level or even a continent-wide issue. We're not there yet. You see that struggle even when you watch the African Union sessions. Like some of them are very much aware, they're in the Black consciousness movement in their mind. Others are still very much far from the center, right? And so they tend to really fight with these ideals, but it does start with the individual, and I think that's a very good place for all of us to start and to think about it each and every day, because when we're not, we're allowing those forces to keep us from thinking of it, and we are leaning towards those other forces. A lot of our behaviors naturally lean away towards our Blackness and our African consciousness as well. We tend to find a way to minimize that part of ourselves when that is who we are, that's our essence, and that shapes everything else that we do. And if it doesn't, then something else is shaping all those things.
Yeah, and I think you and Mike are pointing out too, and in closing, I mean, that idea that this can create, it begins, I guess in closing, we could say that for everyone, it just begins with being intentional about constructing critical consciousness. And if you're intentional and it's more of an intentional thing that you do and a way of life, or that allows you to sort of understand the hegemony and understand the role that perhaps racism, and not just perhaps, but actually racism and neocolonialism can create, it's very crucial in that sense. And I think I like Mike's point on why it matters, which could be a good place to end, in the sense that it does matter because it comes with a worldview. It matters because it comes with beliefs. And it matters because we act based on those beliefs. And as humans, those beliefs define the world we live for ourselves. And the question becomes, when you're constructing that critical consciousness from a Black consciousness perspective, what beliefs drive your way of life? And how does Black consciousness sort of make you realize your superiority and the role that you can play at the center and not in the marginalized peripheries? And so if it matters, then it matters that the process should begin, like we are all saying, with the individual, questioning what beliefs have been driving your lives and how can you start restructuring those beliefs so that your worldview is different, especially starting all the way back, as we have talked in the previous podcast, from a stronger understanding of the history and the historical factors that have perhaps been left out in these narratives, because these the consciousness and everything is always created with the way history is narrated. But if we can identify more accurately with that history, then we can begin to be on this path where we can begin to do, what Mike said. It looks differently in Brazil, Britain, South Africa, US, but the key point is that we are all in this transnational, anti-colonial, anti-racism fight. That it's not about one place or the other, but we're all in it. But we have to begin this way of thought, way of expression, and also way of capturing this agency and acting in ways that actually shape the world in the way we want it to be, not in the way that we have been told it should be. Because if we live with it in the way we've been told it should be, then we allow ourselves to be oppressed and subjugated and to be in servitude. But we can change things, but we have to begin that process. So Linda, thanks for that point, because it begins with these conversations. Of course, many things to peel here. This is the second one on this topic. So we'll definitely be coming back to more of these conversations and trying to think about how we can even ourselves here develop it, but how we can help engage with those who engage with the podcast in doing so. So again, thank you so much for joining us, for listening to this conversation on Black consciousness, something that we will come back again to. We wish you a very wonderful day, evening, or night, wherever you are, and looking forward to being with you again in the next session.
Join us for the next episode of All Things Africa with Levy, Mike, and Linda. To get instant notifications on new episodes, subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to our podcast, or find us on Anchor at anchor.fm/allthingsafrica. Follow us on Twitter and keep the conversation going with the hashtag AllThingsAfrica.